Hey guys, tonight we're steeping ourselves literally and figuratively into the surprisingly soothing world of Victorian insomnia cures. You're lying in bed, candlelight flickering gently against floral wallpaper. Somewhere nearby, a grandfather clock ticks its disapproval, while a mild draft makes the curtains sway ever so slightly. Your chemist has given you a bottle of lettuce tincture, and your great-aunt swears by warm cabbage compresses for restful sleep. Welcome to the age when bedtime was not just a routine, it was a public performance of virtue discipline and leafy experimentation. You probably won't survive this, especially if you forget to remove the pins from your hair before lying down on your goosefeather pillow. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Where you are, I love seeing that sleepy global map light up in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You reach for a delicate porcelain teacup. Inside it, a watery infusion of Lactuca virosa wild lettuce, bitter, slightly earthy, and allegedly soporific. This humble brew was believed to ease you gently into sleep without the moral complications of opiates. Victorian apothecaries marketed it as lettuce opium, though it had none of the addictive highs. Just a vague promise of calm. Some recipes even involved simmering lettuce leaves in milk, a culinary punishment if there ever was one. Mainstream medicine at the time was still getting cozy with the idea of specialized sleep cures. Insomnia wasn't seen as a standalone condition so much as a symptom of other things: nervous disorders, hysteria, poor digestion, or spiritual failing. In polite circles, saying you were troubled at night was code for a host of possible issues, none of them especially chat-worthy at the dinner table. So people reached for plants, valerian lavender, chamomile, poppy syrup. You're encouraged to imagine a cluttered vanity lined with amber glass bottles and handwritten labels, each one promising a gentler night than the last. Some were soothing, others were barely regulated chemical cocktails. Historians still argue whether these sleepy mixtures were truly medicinal or simply placed Bic comforts dressed in Victorian lace. Take hop pillows, for instance, literally pillows stuffed with dried hops, the same plant used to flavor beer. These were nestled beside you, supposedly lulling you to sleep with their bitter aroma. There's actually mild sedative logic here. Hops do contain compounds that interact with the nervous system. Whether or not your nose could detect that over the ambient smell of coal smoke is another story. The most charmingly low-stakes remedy: slipping a piece of lettuce under your pillow. Yes, really. Folklore said it would draw restlessness from your head through osmosis, or maybe just through sheer wishful thinking. You imagine yourself gently placing an iceberg leaf like a dream-catching amulet, smoothing your sheets and pretending you're not mildly concerned about bugs. Tea was everywhere, of course, but not the black jittery stuff served at social calls. This was sleepy tea, a blend of lemon balm, fennel, and possibly a dash of laudanum if the evening had been particularly disagreeable. Some ladies preferred to boil 3 types of leaves and strain them through lace, a process that took long enough to bore you into sleep by itself. The upper middle classes dabbled in these concoctions like modern-day Pinterest enthusiasts. Recipes were swapped at luncheons, quietly judged and annotated in household journals with phrases like "worked for Cousin Ellen, gave Maud a rash." The drinks weren't always pleasant, but they added a ritual to the long, flickering stretch between dinner and bed, something that signaled it was time to settle down and stop panicking about your cousin's elopement or your husband's recent interest in mesmerism. Not to be outdone, the working classes had their own methods, cheaper, heartier, and often served in pubs. A nightcap of porter or stout was considered a poor man's sedative. Sleep for them came after 14 hours of labor, not 4 cups of fennel and lavender tea. The idea of needing help to fall asleep was a luxury they rarely had time for. Still, lettuce water had a certain delicate allure. It was sold in elegant apothecary shops and recommended in women's magazines with headlines like, "To calm the weary mind." These publications, mostly run by men, offered gentle encouragement to exhausted readers who were expected to bear insomnia with the same grace as they bore tight stays and unreliable plumbing. And oh, the lettuce crisp, humble and slightly absurd as a medicinal marvel. Victorian writers praised its soothing humoral balance, a nod to old Greek theories of bodily fluids which were still floating around, if quietly, in some medical circles. You can almost hear your doctor advising you. Cool the blood. Calm the bile, drink your greens. Modern science isn't so sure. While lettuce does contain lactucarium, a mild sedative compound, you'd need to consume a ridiculous quantity to feel any effect stronger than mildly less annoyed. But perhaps that wasn't the point. The ritual mattered. The slow boiling, the gentle pour, the feeling of doing something about your restlessness. Victorians prized control of emotions, of bodies, of schedules. To be at the mercy of sleeplessness was to be un-Victorian. So any method that gave the illusion of agency, drinking a strange brew, stuffing a pillow with flowers, tucking leaves under the bed sheets, was worth clinging to. So tonight, as you lie there imagining the rustle of a paper label and the clink of a teacup against saucer, know that your quest for a good night's sleep connects you with countless 19th century souls, half dozing under embroidered quilts, half hoping their lettuce water would finally kick in. You sit upright as a proper Victorian would before bed, the corset still gently pressing against your ribs because of course you're still in half dress. Even the act of preparing for sleep was governed by rules, laces, and layers. The evening toilette was less about relaxation and more about maintaining appearances, even if only for the bedpost. You dab a bit of rose water on your neck, unpin your hair one bobby pin at a time, 87 to go, and start your nightly routine. But here's the issue, those corsets not exactly breathable. And sleeping in partial attire was sometimes expected for women, especially in shared households where modesty crept into dreams as well as drawing rooms. The Victorians were very fond of structure, both literal and social. Rigid moral codes, rigid furniture, and rigid undergarments. The notion of slipping into bed in, say, a linen shift and nothing else shocking. Unladylike. Possibly French. So you had tight laces and even tighter etiquette about what could be worn after dark. And you weren't exactly encouraged to flop into bed at 9 p.m. and drift off either. Evening rituals were drawn out, almost ceremonial. You were to sit by the hearth, sip something calming, see lettuce water, perhaps read a moral tract, then ease yourself into the mindset required for respectable sleep. Unfortunately, those rituals didn't account for restless legs or existential dread. Even your bed demanded good posture. Victorian mattresses were often thin and uneven, stuffed with horsehair or straw, not quite the luxury memory foam you may know now. The bed frames, usually iron or heavy wood, sometimes so squeaky they sounded like they disapproved of your life choices. Historians still argue whether these strict rituals and uncomfortable environments were genuinely believed to promote sleep, or if they were just holdovers from a time when self-denial was considered a virtue. Perhaps the point wasn't to rest well, it was to be seen trying your very best to do so. Some middle and upper-class Victorians were encouraged to count backward as a way to distract the anxious mind. One etiquette guide recommended whispering verses in Latin while seated on the edge of the bed. Another advised mentally revisiting every single person you'd spoken to that day alphabetically. There's something hilariously ironic about a generation preaching self-restraint, but mentally composing grocery lists and Latin prayers while struggling to sleep. If none of this worked, and let's face it, it didn't, a lady might rise quietly, fetch a book of moral instruction, and read by candlelight for a while. No sensation novels, mind you. Those were considered too stimulating. You wanted something slow, ideally religious, or about plant life, like a 500-page account of how moss grows. Now imagine all this while your body is still constricted by stays. Your room is drafty because insulation isn't really a thing yet, and your mattress feels like it was stuffed with hay and the occasional rogue pebble. Oh, and gas lamps hiss faintly like they're judging you from the corner. There's a curious fringe anecdote from the 1880s about a woman who claimed she finally cured her sleeplessness by unlacing her corset during the Lord's Prayer. Whether it was the prayer or the circulation finally returning to her limbs, we'll never know. Some forward-thinking physicians, always a controversial bunch, began to speak out against nighttime corsetry. One doctor wrote in 1891, "The vital organs must not be corseted during sleep lest dreams become disturbed by the press of one's own ribs." Frankly, he had a point. Of course, men had their own version of bedtime nonsense. Stiff collars, brushed mustaches, possibly even beard nets if you were especially fussy. Sleep was not an invitation to loosen up. It was a time to perform dignity, even if no one was watching. And let's not forget the children. Little ones were often tucked into bed with warming bricks at their feet, and a stern reminder not to fidget. A popular children's bedtime book from the period opens with "Lie still or the dreams won't come." No pressure, right? So here you are, delicately perched on your too-firm bed corset, mostly off candle flickering, a faint clatter from the downstairs kitchen reminding you the staff are still scrubbing. Your body isn't exactly aching to sleep, it's more like your muscles are slowly surrendering to the horizontal position, not out of peace but out of defeat. In all of this, sleep became less about rest and more about managing appearances. Good Victorians didn't just fall asleep, they prepared, they staged, they endured. You imagine loosening that final lace, letting out a sigh that is half exhaustion, half rebellion. Your hair finally spills down over your shoulders, a shocking act of informality. The fire has turned to embers. You lie down, the bed creaks its opinion, and somewhere outside a carriage clatters past. You close your eyes not because you're relaxed, but because it's time. And maybe, just maybe, the lettuce water will finally work. You wake up, figuratively speaking, of course, somewhere in the early morning hours of 1884. The gas lights are out. The embers in your fireplace are cool gray, and your feet have escaped from under the quilt, finding the coldest corner of the bed. And despite the lettuce water, the chamomile, the precisely counted backwards by sevens routine, you're still awake. What now? If you're Victorian, you do not simply roll over and grumble. No, no. You practice first and second sleep, a concept that seems modern to us now, but back then it was practically a cultural given. That's right, sleep was thought to come in two distinct halves. First, sleep began soon after dark, especially in winter months, and lasted until about midnight or so. Then came a waking period, an hour or two in the still dark, when you might pray, read, even engage in marital discussions. Then, ideally, you'd drift back into second sleep, which carried you into morning. So if you're tossing and turning right now, congratulations, you're doing history, right? Some Victorians used this break between sleeps productively. A mother might knit by lamplight, a clerk might copy accounts, and the deeply pious might take the quiet time to reflect on their sins or their neighbors. Historians still argue whether this segmented sleep pattern was a natural human rhythm or simply a social adaptation to long winter nights and early darkness. You rise, wrap yourself in a shawl, and light a bedside candle. The wick flares like a sleepy eye, and you sit by the hearth where embers still glow faintly red. Maybe you reach for your journal. Victorians loved journals, or thumb through a volume of the moral sentiments of small dogs and other creatures. That's not a real book, but it could have been. There's a kind of eerie peace in this hour. Outside, the fog hugs the lampposts and the street is silent. No motor cars, no phones pinging, just the occasional distant hoot of an owl or the clink of the watchman's boots. You are not alone in being awake. All across town, other soft-lit rooms hold other restless minds. For the wealthy, this midnight window might be the only quiet moment of autonomy in a rigidly scheduled life. For the poor, it might be their only chance to read or simply sit still without someone barking orders. And there were even products for this middle night. Candles with shorter burn times, pocket prayer books. One particularly determined entrepreneur sold second sleep biscuits intended to be nibbled between resting phases. They were apparently oat-based and spectacularly bland, designed not to energize, but to lull. One fringe theory at the time blamed indigestion for insomnia, so the act of eating more was seen by some as a cure, which makes as much sense as treating a sunburn by licking the sun. But hey, sleep science was in its larval stage, and people were willing to try anything that didn't smell like vinegar and goat hair. If you were part of the upper classes, you might even take this time to write a letter. Victorian correspondence was a slow-motion form of therapy. You might pour your night thoughts onto thick cream-colored paper, seal it with wax, and tuck it away to be posted at daybreak. You also had options beyond the home. London boasted a small number of 24-hour apothecaries by the late 1800s, and though you wouldn't necessarily go at midnight, you could certainly have something left on order. If you were particularly sleepless and particularly dramatic, you might call for a physician. Though unless you were very ill or very rich, you'd likely be told to drink more barley water and stop reading so many French novels. Meanwhile, physicians began dabbling with sleep charts, early versions of what we now call sleep tracking. These were filled in manually, of course, and wildly unscientific. One example read, "Woke twice, dreamt of flying hats, resumed rest by 2:15, another restless, suspect goose pie to blame." One odd little corner of these wakeful hours' dream interpretation. It was a hobby, a parlor game, and sometimes even a spiritual practice. You might keep a dream diary by the bed, recording your strange half-formed visions during the night break. Did you dream of a white horse, a broken ladder, your second cousin Rupert crying into a sponge? All of it meant something, probably. For many, the mid-sleep interlude was also prayer time. Especially among devout Protestants, this was considered a holy hour, a brief communion with God in the stillest part of the night. There were even prayer pamphlets specifically titled "For the Wakeful Soul" or "Comfort in the Watches of Night," offering you a script when your mind refused to be still. But even here, the expectations were clear. If you were awake, you had better be properly awake. Quiet, gentle, purposeful. No pacing, no sighing, no yelling. I can't sleep into the hallway. Good Victorians bore their insomnia with the same noble restraint they applied to everything else, tightly clenched jaws and decorative lace cuffs. Eventually, though, that second wave of drowsiness would come creeping back. Your candle burns low. Your bones begin to feel heavy. The lace hem of your nightgown whispers against the floor as you shuffle back to bed. You blow out the candle poof and slip under the covers, cold sheets pressing against your skin like a mild punishment. And there it is, that slippery featherlight feeling, the moment when the night wraps back around you like a shawl. Second sleep begins. By now you've surrendered, if not entirely to sleep, then at least to the process of pretending convincingly. The room has gone quiet again. The only sound your own breath, and the occasional creak of the house settling as if it too is weary of Victorian respectability. You shift slightly, trying not to disturb the carefully tucked-in corner of the sheets. It feels like you're sharing the bed with discipline itself. But here's the real kicker: while you wrestle your way into second sleep, you're also being gently poisoned by your wallpaper. Yes, really. Victorian bedrooms were often papered with elaborate, colorful designs, thanks to advances in mass printing and the booming demand for beauty on a budget. Unfortunately, many of those vivid greens, they got their cheerful hue from arsenic. You lie back and stare at the swirling fern pattern on the walls, blissfully unaware that every floral curlicue is possibly off-gassing toxins into the room, and not a minor trace either. In damp conditions, like say a foggy London evening, arsenic-laced wallpaper could emit enough gas to cause headaches, nausea, or in extreme cases, actual death. There were whispers of danger even at the time. Some people fainted near the wall. Children developed odd rashes, but the prints were just so pretty, and doctors, conflicted between commerce and concern, often hesitated to speak too loudly. Historians still argue whether manufacturers truly didn't know the risks or simply chose to ignore them with a polite cough and a change of subject. To be fair, it wasn't just the wallpaper. Your mattress might be stuffed with questionable feathers or horsehair treated with mercury. Your nightcap could be dyed with lead-based pigments. Your room might still be lit by gas lamps prone to leaks, filling the space with invisible carbon monoxide. All of this, and you're still sipping lettuce water to calm your nerves. Let's pause for a moment and appreciate the irony. A civilization that obsessed over morals, manners, and personal hygiene was quite literally sleeping inside a low-grade chemical experiment. But back to the wallpaper. One particularly popular pattern, known as Sheely's green, was the worst offender. It used copper arsenite to achieve that lush botanical green, the sort of color that made you think, ah, nature, right before it gave you respiratory distress. There were even songs written about it, including a grim little ballad called The Arsenic Waltz, poking fun at how fashion and danger were dancing partners in Victorian decor. At the time, there was no concept of off-gassing or indoor air quality. If someone fell ill, they were told to get fresh air, drink beef broth, or try a liver tonic. Never mind the fact that the very walls they leaned against might be the true culprit. This becomes especially bizarre when you learn that some of the people who made the wallpaper, mostly working-class women and children, were themselves becoming mysteriously ill. One factory girl reportedly developed green hands, a condition caused by prolonged exposure to arsenic dyes. Her skin literally absorbed the poison she applied to your bedtime scenery. It wasn't until the late 1880s that serious reform began. Even then, it was slow. Manufacturers insisted their wallpapers were harmless if used properly, which is just another way of saying don't breathe too deeply in your own home. Some homes, particularly in rural areas or the wealthier outskirts of cities, had paperless walls, either painted plaster or wooden panels. But those came with their own nighttime hazards, paint thick with lead and timber varnished with volatile chemicals. The Victorian bedroom was less a sanctuary and more a mildly hazardous display room. You roll over away from the worst of the wallpaper and draw the blanket closer around your shoulders. There's a strange sweetness to the air, faint like almonds. That's not a poetic flourish. Arsenic really does carry a light almond scent, which is great if you're baking cookies, less so if your decor is quietly plotting against you. And just when you think you've cataloged all the sleep-disturbing toxins in the room, here comes the next punch: coal dust. You likely heat your home with a fireplace, and even in summer, soot settles in the corners like a guest that refuses to leave. Bedrooms often shared chimneys with other floors, which meant stray coal particles floated invisibly through your airspace. Not enough to choke you, but enough to coat your lungs over time like a gentle Victorian glaze. It wasn't all doom, of course. Some forward-thinking households began to embrace natural ventilation and less cluttered sleeping spaces. But even then, critics warned that too much fresh air might weaken the blood. You had to find a perfect balance between being poisoned by your wallpaper or drained by the night breeze. Charming. One doctor's journal from 1869 described sleep difficulties in women of fashionable temperament as caused by decorative overstimulation. Yes, that's what he called wallpaper-induced insomnia. His recommendation: remove half the pictures from the room, open one window an inch, and avoid reading anything whimsical. So you lie in bed surrounded by floral death traps and soft, polite gas leaks, trying your very best to sleep deeply and without fuss. Because in the Victorian worldview, if you must be slowly poisoned, you might as well do it gracefully with a nice quilt and maybe a frilly lamp. You close your eyes, breathe through your nose, maybe not too deeply, and wonder briefly if the ferns on the wall have grown just a little greener since dusk. The wallpaper hasn't eaten you yet, which, all things considered, is something of a triumph. And as dawn creeps across the horizon like a cautious housemaid with cold feet, you finally manage to drift off. For a while. Until the light hits your eyelids and the city begins its slow rumble awake. And now you face a new problem: how to survive the next day after such a fractured night's rest. But fear not, Victorian society had an answer to this too. A deeply unhelpful answer perhaps, but an answer all the same. Because if you were tired, listless, or melancholy, you weren't simply sleep deprived. No, you were probably suffering from one of the age's favorite diagnoses, nervous exhaustion. Or if you were particularly fashionable, neurasthenia. This was a blanket term for everything from insomnia to indigestion to mood swings to general existential dread, which, let's be honest, covers most of modern life too. But in the 1800s, it was treated like a tangible bodily ailment, a depletion of your nerve force. You weren't lazy. Your nervous system had just run out of juice. So what could you do about it? Well, for starters, you could take a tonic. There were dozens of them, ranging from the vaguely herbal to the wildly inappropriate. Some contained small doses of cocaine or chloroform or our old friend opium. Others claimed to be based on rare Peruvian bark, ancient Chinese root extracts, or female essence, whatever that means. One best-selling concoction, Dr. Williams' pink pills for pale people, promised to restore both sleep and color to your cheeks. They were mostly iron and sugar, but the marketing unbeatable. Testimonials were printed weekly. After 5 pills, I dreamt of my dead uncle and awoke singing. Whether that's a benefit or a side effect is up for debate. For the more refined or desperate insomniac, there was electrotherapy. Yes, really. Gentle currents were applied to your temples or spine in an effort to revive the nerves. It sounds absurd now, but remember, this was the same era that thought radium water might make your skin glow in a good way. Electrotherapy salons were especially popular in urban centers, where you could book a half-hour session and be wired up like a sleepy marionette. The buzzing current was meant to stimulate your body into balance, though most patients just described it as tingly and odd. Historians still argue whether the placebo effect or sheer boredom was more responsible for its supposed success. And if you had the money, you might consider a trip to a health spa. The Victorians loved their spas. Bathing in mineral-rich waters, taking long walks, drinking sulfuric spring liquid that tasted like eggy regret, this was all part of the rest cure. Spa towns like Bath in England or Baden-Baden in Germany were filled with tired people pretending not to be tired. The regimen was strict, gentle bathing, quiet reading, no excitement. Some even had rules against talking too loudly. The spa was not for giggling. It was for healing your ghost-addled nervous system. Now, if you were a woman, especially a middle or upper-class one, you might be prescribed a full version of the rest cure. This involved bed rest, total uncompromising do-not-move bed rest. For weeks, no reading, no talking, no socializing, just lying still in a quiet room while your meals were brought to you by slightly embarrassed servants. It was believed that women's nervous systems were more delicate, more prone to being overwhelmed by the stress of existing, so bed rest would prevent hysteria, or encourage it. Depends which doctor you asked. And of course, there were plenty of fringe treatments to round out the picture. Magnetic sleep stones, lavender compresses, even hypnotic machines that rotated like a ceiling fan and were supposed to lull your brain into a rhythmic trance. Some resembled oversized music boxes, and one inventor swore his device had cured a duke's niece of both nightmares and kleptomania. A 2-for-1 miracle. Let's not forget the role of food in these cures. According to one London physician, the evening diet was crucial in controlling the vapors and promoting restful slumber. Bland was best. Bread soaked in warm milk, stewed apples, plain rice. Anything too spicy, too crunchy, or too exciting was deemed reckless. And alcohol tricky. A small glass of port or sherry was often prescribed to warm the liver, but anything more could tip you into the hysterics or worse, impure dreams. If none of that worked, you might try what was known as a night ramble. Not a brisk walk, oh no. A ramble, slow with purpose, usually through a quiet park, down a side street, or even around your own garden. It was believed the cool air and repetitive motion would distract the thoughts from unproductive agitation. In practice, it probably just made you cold and more alert. Still, there's something charming about it. You wrapped in a shawl or greatcoat, hands behind your back like a suspicious detective strolling through misty silence at midnight, half meditating, half mumbling curses at your overactive brain. Just you and the moonlight searching not for truth, but for tiredness. And while none of these remedies seem especially effective to our modern eyes, they were deeply sincere. These were people trying to understand the mysterious borderlands between waking and sleep, between health and unrest, long before REM cycles and blue light filters. So as you sit there now, maybe sipping your own modern chamomile tea or scrolling through sleep videos, know that you are in noble company. You and your Victorian predecessors bonded by sleeplessness' strange rituals and the quiet hope that maybe tonight will be the night. You turn out the light again, fluff your pillow, and offer a small ironic toast to Dr. Williams and his mysteriously pink pills. Here's to trying. You're doing quite well, all things considered. You haven't succumbed to the wallpaper. You've resisted the pink pills. You've even survived a night ramble without being mistaken for a Victorian ghost. But now we shift from treatments for insomnia to the behaviors said to cause it, many of which, in true Victorian fashion, blame you entirely. Let's start with your bedtime reading habits because they're probably all wrong. In the 1800s, bedtime reading was common, but it was to be done very carefully. Not too emotional, not too exciting, certainly nothing involving romance, mystery, or heaven forbid science fiction. Those were thought to overheat the imagination, causing mental fevers. You'd lie awake for hours, they warned, mulling over improper ideas, your brain doing laps in the dark. Recommended instead. The Bible, of course, biographies of bishops, or instructional manuals on agriculture. One popular suggestion was The Habits of Insects in Distant Lands, a book so dry it could cause drowsiness just by existing on your nightstand. One woman in Surrey even wrote to her local paper praising the book on the preservation of bark in maritime climates as a sure and steady sedative which is both delightful and deeply tragic. Victorian self-help literature also warned against thinking too much at night. Reflection after dusk is the enemy of peace, claimed one author who clearly had never been asked to process feelings during daylight hours. Instead, people were encouraged to chant simple verses in their head or count imaginary sheep with names like Edwin and Mildred. Some manuals advised visualizing a brick wall and then mentally painting it brick by brick until sleep came. If one finishes the wall, said one pamphlet ominously, they are likely beyond help. Of course, the biggest supposed culprit of insomnia was moral failure. Yes, you heard that right. If you couldn't sleep, perhaps you were guilty of sloth during the day, or envy, or indulgence in idle chatter. One physician suggested insomnia could result from ungoverned appetites and unchecked vanity, which is a lot of pressure for someone who just had trouble winding down after supper. There was a strange logic to this belief. Sleep was seen as a moral act, a gift of the righteous. If you lived a balanced, virtuous life, your body would reward you with peaceful, uninterrupted slumber. If not, well, enjoy your brick wall. Historians still argue whether this moral angle was a sincere belief or just a clever way to make people behave. Either way, the implication was clear: your poor sleep wasn't just a medical issue, it was a personal failure. This is also when the Victorians began to formalize what we now call sleep hygiene, though back then it came with significantly more judgment. One guide recommended that ladies remove all hairpins before bed lest the cold metal disturb the dream ether. Another warned against sleeping in woolen socks as sweaty toes may generate nocturnal fancies. Even your sleeping position came under scrutiny. Back sleeping was preferred. It was believed to be the most modest and pious, encouraging calm thoughts and still hands. Side sleeping was tolerated, but stomach sleeping positively sinful. One popular tract claimed it could lead to nightmares and even inappropriate dreams involving deceased relatives. Naturally, the furniture had its say too. Beds were typically narrow, no sprawling here, and often quite high off the ground. This was both fashionable and practical, keeping the sleeper above floor drafts and occasionally rodents. A well-to-do Victorian bed might have curtains, tassels, and even a tester canopy above which, while beautiful, also trapped heat and the occasional moth. It was a sleeping setup best suited for statuesque stillness, not a sleeper who flops or flails. Beneath the bed was usually a chamber pot because venturing out at night to relieve oneself was considered perilous to digestion and dignity, especially in large homes where the bathroom might be 3 flights away and guarded by a particularly unfriendly grandfather clock. Then there's the matter of sleeping with someone else in the bed. Married couples often shared a mattress, but not always for reasons you'd think. Heating a room was expensive, so 2 bodies meant less coal. However, many upper-class couples actually had separate beds or even rooms, citing the need for uninterrupted rest and modesty. One woman's diary from 1872 laments that her husband snored most unbecomingly and thrashed as if in battle, prompting her to request a gentleman's chamber be established for him down the hall. Meanwhile, lower-class families often all slept in the same bed, parents, children, and sometimes even boarders. One 1840s boarding house report found as many as 5 people sharing a single straw mattress, which makes your awkward Airbnb situation last summer seem luxurious. In any case, your chances of deep restorative sleep in Victorian England were slim if you were either wealthy enough to worry or poor enough to have no options. Let's pause here and imagine it. You followed all the moral instructions. You've eaten your plain rice. You've read 3 pages of prayers for dock workers. You've painted half a mental brick wall. And still, your eyes refuse to close. So you listen to the tick of your bedside clock, a gentle reminder of time slipping through your hands like sand. Not helpful. But in that moment you realize something. It's not just you. Sleeplessness in the Victorian mind is a community of the weary. People like you lying awake across thousands of rooms, all counting bricks, all chasing that elusive silence. It doesn't matter how old the wallpaper is or how strong the valerian smells. The human brain has always been a restless little clock of its own ticking away in the dark. So if you're wide-eyed right now, congratulations. You'd fit in perfectly in 1865. You'd think that by now, with your chamomile breath and wall full of imaginary bricks, your eyelids would have surrendered. But alas, sleep remains coy like a cat perched just out of reach. The Victorians would say time for a change of scenery, not metaphorically but literally, because another widely believed remedy for insomnia was to simply go somewhere else. Enter the age of the sleep excursion. This was the golden age of railway travel and domestic tourism. As the train network expanded, even the perpetually tired could chase slumber across the countryside. Fresh air, they believed, was curative. Not just fresh in the urban eye-opened-a-window sense, but true fresh air. Cold, moist, pine-scented breezes that could only be obtained in rural uplands or seaside towns. You, the weary urbanite, might pack your carpet bag and book passage to a coastal retreat like Margate or a lakeside pension in the Lake District. There you'd take bracing walks before dawn, eat bland oatmeal beside crashing waves, and hope your nervous system would be lulled by seagulls and fog. Historians still argue whether these trips cured the insomniacs or merely distracted them. But distraction itself was valuable. At least you weren't staring at the same haunted gas lamp in your bedroom. For the more ambitious and wealthy, there were continental cures. Swiss mountain air was believed to be particularly soporific, especially if you drank warm milk straight from a goat at sunrise. You might check into a sanatorium in Davos or Lucerne, where white-robed attendants gently forbade excitement and insisted upon napping under wool blankets in wicker lounges shaped like bathtubs. There's a diary entry from a Welsh banker who wrote, "I have slept more in the Alps than in all the years prior due to either altitude or an absence of political conversation." Honestly, both seem plausible. And let's not forget the ocean liners. Insomnia sufferers were sometimes prescribed sea voyages, not for the destination, but for the motion. The gentle sway of a ship was thought to mimic a mother's cradle, rocking the adult nervous system into tranquility. The reality, of course, was a little different. Early steamships were not known for their stability. Many passengers found themselves not soothed, but violently seasick, which did take their minds off insomnia, albeit through misery. But even if you stayed ashore, you could still engage in a domestic reset. Change the room, move your bed to a different wall, swap curtains, repaint with a calming color like sage green or light mustard. And of course, if you were truly committed, you might replace your mattress with a horsehair one imported from Vienna. Why Vienna? Because someone somewhere decided that Austro-Hungarian horses made for a superior sleep experience. These sorts of changes were often more symbolic than scientific. A declaration, I will trick my brain into resting, if not through chemistry, then through aesthetics. Now, while travel and decor were respectable options, there was also a darker Victorian undercurrent: spiritual intervention. Some insomniacs turned to clergy. A restless mind, they believed, could indicate spiritual unrest. Maybe you'd failed to confess something. Maybe you needed to atone. Or maybe you were being visited in the night by mischievous spirits. Not demons exactly, but restless energies with opinions. One pamphlet from 1881 insists that a woman in Birmingham was unable to sleep for 6 years until her chimney was exorcised. There were groans from the flue, she claimed, and once a chicken bone fell from the hearth with no known source. The priest who visited declared the fireplace emotionally congested. That was enough to convince her. And then, of course, there were dream interpreters. If you could sleep but suffered disturbing dreams, these shadowy figures would gladly analyze them for a fee. Dreaming of water, repressed tears, dreaming of cows. You were too ambitious, dreaming of clocks. Death was near, but not too near, which was somehow worse. As for nightmares, oh, those were serious business. Victorians often viewed them as messages from the unconscious or signs that the body was digesting improperly. More than one cookbook warned against eating cheese at supper as dairy incubates horrors. To this day, some Brits blame a slice of Stilton for their most surreal nighttime adventures. You might in desperation turn to a mesmerist. Yes, that's right. Hypnotism was considered a legitimate remedy for sleeplessness. You'd recline in a well-upholstered chair while a man in pince-nez and too much pomade waved a crystal on a string and murmured phrases like, "Your thoughts are birds, let them fly," which either worked or gave you a lifelong fear of pigeons. There are records of mesmerists working entire circuits of British towns hailed like rock stars by the weary and desperate. Some even performed public demonstrations. One notable show in Edinburgh ended with an audience member falling asleep for 17 hours, though it's suspected he may have just had a flask of gin. Even Queen Victoria herself had a private hypnotist, though it was quietly called therapeutic magnetism to avoid scandal. In the end, whether through Swiss goats' haunted chimneys or decorative pillows from Vienna, the Victorian insomniac rarely ran out of options. Exhaustion was both an affliction and a fashionable hobby. You were allowed to suffer so long as you suffered in style. And here you are in the soft candlelight of your own mind, imagining yourself boarding a train to the coast, a carpet bag in hand, a ticket in your glove. You settle into your seat, the engine chuffs, and as the countryside rolls by, you almost forget what you came here to escape. That twitch in your eyelid, that whisper of wakefulness, that one deeply Victorian fear that you might spend another night being perfectly tired and perfectly awake. If travel hypnotism and spiritual chimney cleansing haven't yet worked, perhaps it's time to explore the more creative corners of Victorian sleep science, namely their deep fascination with gadgets. Because when the Victorians weren't writing moral essays or naming sheep, they were busy inventing things, especially machines designed to force you to rest. Your tour of strange contraptions begins with something deceptively simple: the weighted blanket. Yes, it's not a modern invention. Back in the 19th century, these were referred to as gravity quilts. Often filled with sand or iron pellets, they were marketed to nervous women and melancholic scholars who suffered from what was known as nocturnal unrestfulness. The theory was that pressure would prevent the body from twitching or wandering, but at 10 to 20 pounds of iron-studded linen, these blankets did more than calm. One diary entry from a Yorkshire woman says, "It soothed my nerves, but bruised my hips." So, mixed results. Next on your dream-inducing tour, the clockwork lullaby chair. This short-lived mechanical wonder was invented in 1876 by a man with the impossibly British name of Basil Featherstone. The chair was meant to rock gently using hidden gears powered by a small wind-up crank. In theory, you'd fall asleep as the chair lulled you like an obedient ant. In practice, it ticked loudly, squeaked constantly, and occasionally shifted with a sudden jolt. One advertisement noted optimistically that light injuries are rare and quickly forgotten. Not exactly a bedtime promise. Still, the idea of mechanical solutions held power. In London, a short-lived clinic promised better sleep through what they called stimulated rest environments. These were padded rooms outfitted with low-frequency humming machines, slowly dimming gas lights, and in one experimental setup, a gentle misting system that sprayed lavender water from overhead nozzles. The patient, guest would recline in a canvas hammock while attendants whispered phrases like, "You are now a soft spoon in warm custard." A lovely sentiment, but one client reportedly awoke soaked and disoriented, declaring, "I dreamt I was soup." Let's not forget the pillow technology. Victorians took pillows quite seriously, much more than you probably do. There were horsehair pillows, cedar chip pillows, water-filled pillows, and even an aromatic pillow filled with dried herbs designed to calm the thoughts of over-schooled boys. Most of them smelled like an argument between a spice rack and a musty attic. One patent from 1891 describes a dream induction head cushion which released tiny puffs of rose oil through the night. In theory, this would trigger sweet dreams. In practice, it often just triggered sneezing. Then there was the bedtime breathing apparatus. Yes, really. This early precursor to the CPAP machine wasn't about sleep apnea, it was about oxygen purity. Victorians were convinced that urban air was partially to blame for sleeplessness. Enter the nocturnal respiratory dome, a translucent helmet that fit over your head and fed in purified atmospheric elements from a bellows system. Imagine a brass and glass space helmet strapped to your head, hissing quietly all night. The inventor insisted it evoked the atmosphere of alpine meadows. Most users reported panic. Historians still argue whether these devices were ever truly meant to succeed or simply created to soothe the anxiety of the insomniac. If you've ever bought a sleep app, a magnesium mist, or a $140 weighted bear, you understand this impulse. Sometimes just trying something, anything, feels better than trying nothing. And some gadgets, in fairness, were less wild and more subtle. For example, the sleep journal became popular in the 1880s. Yes, journaling. You'd sit at your bedside with a stub of pencil and record your thoughts before sleeping. The goal wasn't poetic, it was practical. Empty your brain onto the page one guidebook instructed lest it spill during the night. These journals often included the day's meals, bowel movements, and emotional triggers. In one remarkable entry, a woman blames her sleeplessness on a quarrel with my maid and an oversalted turnip. Ah, the fragile web of sleep. Then there was the insomnia hat. Imagine a soft cap lined with waxed linen and stitched through with copper coils. You'd place it gently on your head at night, and it would redirect cranial energies downward, supposedly allowing restful impulses to flood the lower limbs. The only flooding most users reported was sweat. But perhaps the strangest of all inventions, the bedtime scent cannon. Marketed under the dramatic name Morpheus Mist Delivery apparatus, this little brass cannon was meant to be filled with powdered lavender, which you would then light gently and allow to puff toward your bed like a tiny herbal howitzer. Its creator claimed the scent conquers insomnia like a knight subduing a restless dragon. One woman in Bath attempted to use it near her lace curtains, which then very nearly became the dragon. It's easy to laugh at these inventions, but remember, these weren't jokes to the people who bought them. They were desperate, hopeful, convinced that one more purchase might be the key to the sleep they craved. And here you are centuries later, also lying awake, possibly next to a phone screen, perhaps with a $40 lavender pillow behind your head. Different time, same need. Humans never change quite as much as they think. So imagine yourself now in a softly ticking Victorian bedroom, the scent of dried herbs in the air, a journal on your lap, a mechanical rocking chair gently, not squeaking this time, just swaying. You're not cured exactly, but you're comforted, and sometimes comfort is the first step. So, you've journaled, you've sniffed lavender smoke, you've worn a hat full of copper coils, and yet, sleep remains a polite stranger standing just outside the door holding a calling card, but never knocking. By now, any sensible Victorian would have arrived at a conclusion both strange and oddly optimistic. Maybe it's not your fault. Maybe it's the atmosphere itself, too noisy, too modern, too impolite. Cue the rise of the Victorian soundscape movement. You see, long before anyone uttered the phrase white noise machine, Victorians were experimenting with sonic environments for better rest. Because as more people moved into cities, they realized that nighttime was no longer quiet. It was filled with the clatter of carriages, the calls of night porters, and in some areas the mournful howls of unsupervised peacocks, a real Victorian lawn fad, unfortunately. To counteract the sonic chaos, certain thinkers proposed curated nighttime noise sounds specifically chosen to ease the mind. You might, for example, commission a servant to play a sleep reel on the pianoforte, a looped gentle lullaby repeated until their fingers numbed. Or you might purchase a music box clock, which played a tinkling waltz every half hour to soothe you into a light rhythmic trance. One particular favorite, the sound of rain on canvas. Wealthy insomniacs had outdoor sleep tents pitched on balconies or lawns where they could lie under a waxed awning and listen to artificial droplets fall. If the weather refused to cooperate, a servant might be tasked with drizzling water over the tent's top from a watering can over and over. Historians still argue whether this approach actually helped or simply exhausted the household staff so thoroughly that they all slept soundly at least. Some households invested in elaborate aquarium cabinets built with flowing water and placed near the bed. Watching the fish drift among ferns and miniature castles was thought to hypnotize the mind, and the trickle of water acted like a lullaby. One popular design, the sleeping river cabinet, featured a crank-operated waterfall and a small compartment for opium drops, because of course it did, of course. And of course, where water flowed, electricity soon followed. By the 1890s, early adopters of home electricity began experimenting with electro-sleep devices. These weren't quite the high-voltage horrors you might imagine, though, to be clear, they still involved mild current being applied to the temples or wrists. One advertisement read, "Soothe the cerebral storms with a regulated whisper of current." Basically zap your brain until it gives up. The contraptions usually looked like something between a stethoscope and a torture device. You'd strap on a leather headband, flip a switch, and allow yourself to tingle gently into unconsciousness. Or so the sales pitch went. More than one review includes the phrase, burnt fringe. Less invasive, but no less ambitious, was the vibrating mattress, not the modern kind, sadly. The Victorian version involved a crank at the foot of the bed, which your long-suffering spouse would manually turn for several minutes, setting off a pulsing ripple through the horsehair stuffing. It was marketed under names like the Undulation Respite Platform and Dr. Keen's Sleeping Slab. One testimonial wrote, "I have never been so shaken into serenity." A different letter from a disgruntled Scottish minister simply reads, "My wife insists it is sorcery." There's also an entire subgenre of Victorian sleep aids we might call ritual distractions. These were nightly routines designed less to induce sleep and more to tire the brain into forgetting it was awake. One popular option, alphabet walks. You'd lie in bed and mentally walk through a familiar location, your garden for instance, spotting objects in alphabetical order. A is for arbor, B is for bird bath, C is for cruel insomnia, and so on. Others counted backwards from 1,000 in steps of 7. A surprising number of insomnia guides swear this works despite the fact that even basic subtraction becomes emotionally taxing after midnight. Or if arithmetic wasn't your strength, you might engage in a form of imaginary speech writing. Imagine delivering a formal address to a quiet crowd. The topic utterly mundane, the history of my socks, or why I respect the spoon. The sheer boredom they promised would lull your brain into slumber. Then there's scent mapping, a ritual often suggested in women's health guides. You'd lie down and recall every smell you'd encountered that day from morning to night. From the toasted oats at breakfast, to the rosewater perfume of your neighbor, to the faint horse dung by the milliner's shop. By the time you'd mentally sniffed your way through 12 hours sleep, would hopefully ambush you mid-odor. You might be wondering, did any of this work? The answer is, sometimes. Because the truth is, these rituals weren't entirely about curing insomnia. They were about control, about feeling like you had a system, a defense against the yawning darkness. So tonight, in your own version of a humming Victorian room, maybe try one of these things. Imagine the fish gliding behind glass, count backwards by 7s, or recite a speech to the Royal Academy about the virtues of beige socks. You're not broken, you're just wired oddly, like a pianoforte that only plays when no one's listening. And maybe, just maybe, one of these softly absurd rituals will tip you into dreams. You've tried scents, sounds, electric pillows, and alphabetized bird baths, and still, here you are blinking gently into the darkness, wondering if Victorians ever just gave up and screamed into their feather beds. Well, not exactly, because when all else failed, there was always diet, the next great frontier of sleep science. And yes, Victorian insomnia cures had strong culinary opinions. To begin, let's talk about lettuce water, the leafy legend teased in the title. Lettuce, especially the old-fashioned variety called Lactuca virosa, was believed to contain calming properties. Doctors wrote of its hypnotic sap and dream-inducing milk. Of course, it wasn't the crisp romaine you get in your sad lunchtime salad. This was bitter, rubbery, medicinal lettuce. The process was simple. Boil a head of lettuce in water for half an hour, strain it, and drink the lukewarm, greenish liquid before bed. One Victorian guide notes that a spoonful should suffice for those of nervous temperament. 2, if melancholy has taken hold. As for taste, think soggy spinach tea with a hint of garden hose, but many swore by it and some even referred to it as nature's laudanum. Though let's be clear, it definitely didn't work as well as laudanum. Still, lettuce wasn't alone in the dream pantry. Another staple, warm milk with nutmeg. Nutmeg was thought to have mild sedative properties and when mixed with dairy created what one pamphlet called a gentle trickle for the nerves. You were instructed to sip slowly while sitting upright in bed, ideally wearing wool socks and thinking calming thoughts about hedgerows or the Queen. For the wealthier insomniacs, beef tea, a thin broth made from simmered beef shavings, was all the rage. Supposedly fortifying yet gentle, this broth was touted as night-appropriate nourishment, which sounds more like a cryptic threat than medical advice. Still, it was believed to give strength to weak sleepers, as if you could bicep curl your way to dreams. Interestingly, sleep fasting also made an appearance in some circles. The theory went, digestion demands energy and energy keeps you alert, so certain purists advocated for eating nothing after 400 p.m. They claimed that by reducing internal activity, you could trick your body into winding down. Historians still argue whether this helped or whether it simply led to a rise in midnight snacking and whispered arguments in candlelit kitchens over leftover jam tarts. Then there were the herbal candies often sold at apothecaries with names like Dream Drops or Moon Lozenges. These little treats contained chamomile valerian root, sometimes a suspicious dusting of morphine, or calming agents as labels politely put it. One particularly infamous variety called Dr. Gilderoy's Sleep Pearls contained crushed pearls, rose essence, and a touch of opium encased in sugar. Fancy, ineffective, but very expensive. If you wanted something a little more rugged, country healers offered slumber syrup often made of boiled apple skins, cloves, and raw honey. You'd take a spoonful and immediately lie flat. According to one letter, the syrup warms the chest and clouds the eyes. According to modern taste buds, it probably also glued your teeth together. And let's not forget the odd obsession with onions. Yes, onions. Victorian health manuals sometimes recommended placing a halved onion near the bedside. It wasn't to be eaten, just sniffed periodically. The theory was that the sulfur released from the onion acted as a sedative and that its raw scent was grounding to the restless soul. One woman reportedly tied a small onion to the inside of her bonnet ribbon so she could inhale it as she drifted off. Her husband refused to sleep in the same room. Honestly fair. At boarding schools and women's colleges, dietary rules became even more specific. Sleep-deprived students were discouraged from eating strong cheeses or preserved meats under the belief that these caused night frights. One dormitory menu recommended plain porridge, milky toast, and plumless pudding as ideal soporific fare. A culinary punishment, if ever there was one. But for the more adventurous palate, there were experimental regimens. One doctor, Sir Edwin Halstone, insisted that banana custard held the key to dreamless recuperation. Another, less successful, promoted a mix of boiled eel and fennel as a nighttime elixir. His patients reportedly fell asleep mostly out of avoidance. And of course, no exploration of Victorian bedtime diets would be complete without alcohol. Now, technically, nightcaps were discouraged by high-minded medical professionals, but everyday Victorians were far more pragmatic. A little sherry or port before bed, entirely normal. A brandy-soaked biscuit, even better. But moderation was key. As one 1883 journal notes, "Too much tipple invites the night terrors. Truer words may never have been whispered over a lace-trimmed glass of elderflower liqueur." All these food-based approaches point to a deeper Victorian belief that the body was a system, a network of balances and humors and vapors. Feed it poorly and you insult its sleep. Nourish it gently and it will reward you with sweet, uninterrupted unconsciousness. So picture yourself now in a candlelit kitchen. A pot gently simmers on the iron stove. The scent of nutmeg curls through the air. You pour yourself a spoonful of lukewarm lettuce water, not because it tastes good, but because it represents hope. You raise the cup, you sip, you exhale. And somewhere in your brain, whether by placebo or miracle, something lets go. Let's say you've drunk your warm milk, eaten your soggy toast, and even placed a brave onion slice beside your pillow. And yet, the shadows on the wallpaper continue their slow parade and the ceiling still looks far too interested in your insomnia. Now, dear friend, it's time for the Victorians' most awkward and oddly popular solution to sleeplessness: exercise. Yes, even at midnight. You see, while the modern world promotes no screens before bed, the Victorians swore by light calisthenics. It sounds ridiculous, but to them the key to sleep was not necessarily stillness, it was rhythm, controlled movement, gentle repetition, something to exhaust the nerves without igniting them. Enter the bedroom gymnastics routine. Popularized in health manuals for nervous ladies and melancholic clerks, these routines involved slow, deliberate motions done in complete silence. You might begin by standing beside the bed, arms raised like a sleepy semaphore. Then bend slowly to touch your toes twice. Then, of course, rotate the arms in wide circles as if preparing for takeoff. One guide refers to these as gentle rotations to coax the mind inward. Another recommends shadow rowing. You sit at the edge of the mattress and pantomime rowing across a still lake. Your arms move, your back arches, your imagination does the rest. Visualize yourself alone on a mirror-smooth lake, the guide reads, gliding slowly past weeping willows, their long branches touching the surface. That's poetic and mildly sad, which frankly is peak Victorian. But it wasn't all romantic mental sculling. Some guides leaned more scientific, suggesting routines based on Swedish gymnastics, a precursor to modern physical therapy. These included stretches, gentle squats, and back arches, performed in slippers and flannel, usually next to a slowly dying fire. The idea was to vibrate the body back to its natural sleepful state, which sounds a bit like tuning a cello made of meat. Others believed in the power of pressure and release, tightening various muscle groups and then relaxing them. Yes, this is suspiciously similar to what we now call progressive muscle relaxation, a staple of modern sleep therapy. The Victorians did it first, in corsets. Of course, this approach had its downsides. For one thing, bedrooms weren't particularly roomy. Dodging candle stands, chamber pots, and low-hanging gas lamps made calisthenics a bit dangerous. There's a documented case of one woman knocking herself unconscious while attempting a backbend beside her canopy bed. The doctor prescribed bed rest. She finally slept. Then there were special tools, because of course there were. Ever heard of the sleeping hoop? It was essentially a padded ring you'd roll gently along your arms and shoulders, under the belief that this physical contact helped direct the restless humors outward. A gentleman's magazine once published an article titled "The Sleeping Hoop, a Gentleman's Best Companion," which unintentionally raised a few eyebrows. Others employed weighted lap blankets, often stuffed with sand or buckwheat pressed against the thighs to quiet the nerves in the limbs. These were especially recommended for those suffering from twitching calf, a term that may or may not have referred to restless leg syndrome. Historians still debate whether these physical approaches helped or simply distracted people from the existential horror of insomnia. Either way, the message was clear: motion can be medicine. But even odder than exercise were the Victorians' experiments with posture-based sleep therapy. Forget lying flat. Some guides insisted that sleeping in a slightly upright position with 4 or more pillows allowed the gases of agitation to escape upward, leaving the brain untroubled. Others took the opposite route, 1 pillow only with the head turned slightly left so that dreams might flow from the liver without obstruction. This assumes, of course, that dreams are made in the liver, a theory long since discredited but deeply cherished by several amateur physicians. There was even an 1870 pamphlet titled "The Chin-Tucked Method of Inducing Somnolence," which argued that tilting the chin downward while lying still allowed gravity to pull the soul towards sleep. Critics pointed out that it also just gave you neck cramps. Still, if the goal was to sleep, then no idea was too far-fetched. Case in point, bed orientation. Some Victorians swore by aligning the bed with magnetic north. It was believed that doing so harmonized the body's internal compass, allowing the bloodstream to calm its tides. A certain Dr. Penfield claimed his patients experienced 37% deeper sleep after rotating their beds. His methodology unsurprisingly involved a forked stick and a chicken feather on a string. Then came the practice of floor sleeping, not for the poor, but for the sleepless elite. The hard floor was seen as a corrective tool for spinal disarray. By sleeping on a padded mat, believers claimed one could flatten the overwrought spine and restore dream-conducting channels, which is both medically dubious and deeply uncomfortable. By now, you may be wondering how anyone actually slept in this era given the volume of instructions, potions, and calisthenics. The truth is, it wasn't about perfection, it was about ritual. Ritual breeds control. Control breeds comfort. Comfort, in turn, welcomes sleep. So tonight, maybe do a few slow shoulder rolls. Pretend to row across a silent Victorian lake. Align your pillows with magnetic north. Or just try to lie still with your chin tucked down and your feet swaddled in weighted socks and see what dreams may come. After all, you're in good company. Somewhere a Victorian in a bonnet is rowing quietly beside you. You've stretched, rowed, sniffed an onion, and sipped something that tastes like boiled curtain. But your eyes are still open, aren't they? The gas lamp flickers. The clock ticks on. And somewhere a horse-drawn carriage rattles over cobblestones outside. If you were a proper Victorian, you might be starting to wonder, could this insomnia be spiritual? Yes, friends, welcome to the ethereal end of the Victorian sleep spectrum. When tinctures, turnips, and toe rotations failed, some turned to faith, mysticism, and the cosmic unknown. At the heart of this movement was a belief that sleeplessness wasn't just a medical or nervous condition, it was a symptom of being out of harmony with the soul. If your dreams were absent, perhaps your spirit had gone wandering, or perhaps something else had wandered in. Let's begin with the sleep diary movement, a trend that emerged among spiritualists, reformers, and amateur philosophers. These handwritten journals were meant to capture nighttime thoughts and visions. But more than that, they were a tool for evaluating the purity of one's soul. The logic went like this: if your nighttime scribbles were coherent, calm, and well-spelled, your spirit was aligned and restful. But if your pages devolved into wild loops and half-formed sentences about frogs and bowler hats or talking curtains, then clearly something within you was unsettled. Some individuals took this further, attempting pre-sleep meditations that focused on recalling the day's virtuous acts. One, Reverend Wimpleton, in 1873, advised his parishioners to mentally count good deeds before bed. Begin with acts of charity, proceed to politeness, and end with frugality. Sleep will greet the clean of heart. And when even moral inventory didn't help, there were, of course, ghosts. The Victorian period was famously ghost-friendly. Seances, spirit boards, ghost stories read aloud in parlors. Naturally, some believed insomnia to be the result of haunted bedrooms and echo of unseen energies tugging at your peace. In one chilling and slightly silly report from 1881, a London woman insisted that her inability to sleep was caused by a spectral grandmother who disapproved of her new curtains. She replaced them with lace. The haunting stopped. She slept. Some tried protective charms, lavender in satchels, prayer cards beneath pillows, even little hand-sewn pouches of sea salt and rosemary stitched into pillowcases. These were meant to guard the threshold of dreams, which sounds like something out of a bedtime RPG. Others recited special verses, usually lifted from scripture or poetry, chosen to steady the breath and anchor the mind. One popular favorite, a line from Wordsworth: "The silence that is in the starry sky, the sleep that is among the lonely hills," whispered 3 times with hands folded over the chest. But spirituality wasn't just about divine sleep protection. It was also about embracing the idea that waking at night might not be a problem but a gift. In fact, some spiritual advisors promoted the 2 sleeps model of rest. You would go to bed shortly after dusk sleep for 4 hours, wake naturally in the middle of the night, and spend 1 or 2 quiet hours reading scripture, meditating, or journaling before returning to bed until sunrise. This concept wasn't unique to Victorians, it dates back centuries. But the Victorians spiritualized it, describing those wakeful hours as holy silence. They believed that insomnia might be a divine invitation to reflect, to pray, to listen for wisdom. Historians still argue whether this middle-of-the-night interlude was culturally driven, biologically natural, or just a very polite way of admitting no one could sleep through their neighbors' snoring. Meanwhile, on the scientific fringe, some thinkers suggested that sleeplessness was a sensitivity to cosmic vibrations. Yes, cosmic vibrations. One man, Professor Ambrose Ketley, claimed that certain nervous types, usually women or poets, were more attuned to planetary alignments and solar flares, and thus more likely to suffer nighttime agitation. He recommended a shielding balm made from zinc and crushed chamomile applied to the temples during full moons. Surprisingly, it didn't catch on. Then there was dream incubation, the effort to steer your dreams using symbolic objects and bedtime intentions. A person might place a rose quartz under the pillow for love, or sleep with a sketch of a departed relative to invite dream contact. This wasn't mainstream, but it enjoyed a niche following among artists, mystics, and people with excellent penmanship. Some even believed that certain beds attracted better dreams. For instance, there were rumors about oak frame beds producing steadier slumber than iron ones. A traveling healer claimed that brass frames, being conductive, invited moon currents that could disrupt rest. He sold small woolen grounding pads to place beneath the bed legs. They resembled crocheted coasters. They were, in fact, crocheted coasters. Even the placement of mirrors came under scrutiny. Facing one toward the bed, a clear no-no. It was said to reflect your dreams back at you, amplifying unrest. Covering mirrors with cloth at night became a common precaution. And while all of this might seem like Victorian overthinking, the truth is, it was comforting. When you feel powerless in the face of insomnia, placing a charm beside your bed or aligning your mattress with a constellation gives you something to hold on to. It makes the night feel less random, less cruel, less lonely. And maybe that's the real heart of Victorian sleep spirituality. The quiet belief that you were part of a larger rhythm, unseen but benevolent, and that sleep-like grace could be earned through ritual reverence or simply waiting. So tonight, as the room darkens and the hush settles, you may feel the air stir with that same mystery. Maybe light a candle, whisper a poem, face north, or just let yourself believe for a moment that your dreams know the way home. By now, you've seen the Victorians stretch Sniff Pray Row Journal and quietly panic about their bed's compass orientation. But we're not done yet, because there's still one more class of insomnia cure left to explore. And it's perhaps the most ridiculous of them all. The professional sleep coach. Yes, that was a real job. Of course, they didn't call themselves coaches. That would be far too modern and energetic. Instead, they preferred titles like sleep companion, rest consultant, or the slightly unsettling somnolent steward. And while these figures may have been rare, their advice and services, often advertised in newspapers or discreetly passed via salon gossip, were very real to those desperate enough to pay for slumber. Let's imagine you're a wealthy Victorian insomniac. You've tried the lettuce water, the onion poultice, the sacred psalms. Still, the yawning void of night stretches on. What do? You hire someone. A sleep companion might arrive at your home in the evening wearing soft slippers and carrying a carpet bag full of night aids. These ranged from aromatic sachets and calming tinctures to velvet blindfolds, clockwork lullaby boxes, and handwritten mantras written in exquisite cursive. Step 1: preparation. The room must be cleansed. not spiritually, just atmospherically. Heavy drapes pulled, lamps dimmed, all ticking clocks either removed or muffled in wool. Soundless serenity is step one, one companion wrote in a 1884 column for the Ladies' Weekly Rest. Next, they might read aloud not exciting novels but dreary ones. Sleep companions curated personal libraries full of the most plodding, verbose prose they could find. Dry travelogues, obscure theological treatises, books with titles like A Disquisition upon the Tallow Trade of Northumbria. If you began to nod off mid-page, the companion would stop immediately. If not, they'd change tack, perhaps moving on to the weighted pressure method. This involved placing a light but firm weight, usually a woolen shawl, folded several times over the sleeper's legs. It was thought to anchor the soul, which apparently had a bad habit of floating around during insomnia. Weighted blankets, it turns out, are not new. Other services included rhythmic touch, which is less creepy than it sounds. A gentle tapping of the shoulder or wrist at a slow, steady pace designed to lull the nervous system into mimicking the rhythm. Breath matching, where the companion would lie in a nearby chair and breathe deeply exaggeratedly so that the sleepless party might subconsciously mirror them. Scent circulation, involving the slow wafting of lavender oil on a folded handkerchief in front of a fireplace to create gentle scent breezes across the room. Some did this with cardamom or anise, though not everyone agreed those were sleep-inducing. One poor woman passed out not from sleep, but from nausea. Now, not everyone could afford such services, but for the upwardly mobile insomniac, having a sleep expert visit was a kind of status symbol, a sign that you were cultured, delicate, and fashionable enough to struggle with sleep. Yes, even insomnia had class politics. Meanwhile, for the middle and working classes, similar help could be found in public lectures. These often took place in rented drawing rooms or back rooms of chemist shops. One such speaker, a man known only as Dr. Nocturne, delivered sold-out talks in Brighton titled Taming the Night Mind. He wore a robe and carried a wand made of polished cedar. He also sold pamphlets, tea blends, and something called lunar lozenges, which were basically mints, but even more affordable were the DIY kits sold in magazines. These kits, often advertised with illustrations of fainting women in lovely bedclothes, included instructions for self-hypnosis for the sleepless. A typical exercise involved staring into a small mirror reciting, "I am the dusk, I am the hush, I am the drift." Repeating that 30 times supposedly convinced your brain to take the hint. Historians still argue whether these practices were sincere health measures or simply a theatrical placebo for wealthy insomniacs. The consensus, probably both. And as ridiculous as it might sound, the role of a sleep coach wasn't so different from what we see today: calming presence, sensory management, gentle ritual. The difference is velvet blindfolds and spiritual anchoring. Still, the most touching accounts of Victorian sleep support come not from hired experts, but from family traditions. Fathers pacing with wakeful children reciting stories of sleepy trains and moonlit foxes. Mothers rubbing a child's back in slow, deliberate circles, humming songs passed down from their own grandmothers. Siblings whispering lullabies about boats that floated on stars. These were the real sleep coaches. No certificates, no coaching fees, just quiet gestures passed through generations. Actions that said, "You're safe, you're held, it's okay to let go." So if you find yourself wide-eyed and restless, wondering whether you need a sleep companion or a bed aligned with Venus, remember sometimes the most effective comfort is the simplest one. A slow breath, a kind voice, a little trust in the night. You don't have to do this alone. At last we find ourselves at the crumbling edge of the Victorian night, the hour when the gas lights sputter low. The house grows silent, and even the most determined insomniacs begin bargaining with the furniture. If I close my eyes and pretend the bed is a boat, you think maybe I can drift off by sheer metaphor. But let's be honest, you've tried everything short of hiring a psychic badger. Which brings us to the strangest, sleepiest corners of the Victorian imagination. The final chapter of this long, sleepless journey, the dream machines, the bedtime oddities, and the people who went full mad scientist in pursuit of unconsciousness. Let's start with one of the most delightful contraptions, the slumber helmet. Invented in 1879 by a Dr. Linley Paddington, a name that screams top hat and chaos. This absurd device resembled a cross between a beekeeper's hood and a wind instrument. It was made of padded leather, covered the entire head, and had little tubes that funneled lavender oil directly to the nose. Dr. Paddington believed that immersing the senses in floral darkness would soothe the overactive mind. There was unfortunately a design flaw. The helmet also muffled breathing to the point of light suffocation. Many found it unsettling. but others swore it lulled the nerves into a velvet quiet. Historians still argue whether this effect was sleep or very mild asphyxia. Another eccentric invention was the clockwork drowsifier. This tabletop device resembled a music box crossed with a cuckoo clock. When wound, it produced slow, lulling, ticking sounds interspersed with miniature chimes meant to guide the brain through stages of descent. Think of it as a Victorian white noise machine, but with a strong potential for haunting. There were weighted sleep tents made of canvas and suspended from 4 brass rods over the bed, meant to enclose the sleeper in sound-filtering serenity. Supposedly used by sensitive poets and one Belgian opera singer who couldn't bear the noise of his own heartbeat. You might be wondering, did any of these devices work? Well, maybe sleep studies hadn't been invented yet, so most of the evidence comes from excited diary entries and enthusiastic newspaper testimonials like "I awoke refreshed and buoyant as if reborn in molasses." Not exactly peer-reviewed. But beyond gadgets, the Victorian obsession with sleep extended to bed architecture. Some believed that a curved headboard encouraged better dreams. Others swore by canopy beds, insisting the cloth barrier created a dream cocoon. One extravagant trend even included beds with built-in music boxes designed to play low waltzes as you fell asleep. If it sounds romantic, it wasn't. Several accounts mention people jolting awake when the mechanisms jammed and played an accidental polka. Meanwhile, in more modest homes, bedtime rituals leaned towards the quirky and endearing. Some placed dried apples on the windowsill, a supposed folk charm to draw out sleeplessness. Others kept a piece of coal under the bed to absorb excess night heat, which Victorians believed could bubble up from the earth and agitate the nerves. There were also highly specific dream recipes. You'd eat a slice of toast rubbed with nutmeg or a teaspoon of caraway seeds soaked in sherry. Some instructions went so far as to suggest sleeping with a potato in your hand. Not for warmth, just to ground the body's vitality. No one knows why. It was the age of Queen Victoria and mystery root vegetables. At the very fringe of bedtime behavior were those who believed in sleep fasting. The idea was that insomnia could be conquered not through herbs or hypnosis, but through sheer abstinence from sleep altogether. You'd stay up for 36 or even 48 hours in hopes of crashing so hard your body would reset its inner dials. This was often attempted by eccentric inventors or extremely stubborn clergymen. Unsurprisingly, it rarely ended well. And then there were the dream diarists. These weren't casual journals, they were full-blown sleep manuscripts. Pages and pages of scrawled narratives about skywalking on marzipan clouds or speaking to Queen Elizabeth I through a stovepipe. These dreams weren't interpreted so much as cataloged, as though mapping the unconscious mind could eventually lead to reliable sleep architecture, which of course it couldn't. But the belief alone helped. Victorians were very good at convincing themselves that systems equaled solutions. What stands out above all is just how tenderly the Victorians approached sleep. They wrote about it like a long-lost friend. They chased it with both desperation and delight. They personified it in poems as a gentle woman with cool hands or a vaporous beast you had to tame with warm milk and polite begging. For every wacky contraption or dubious concoction, there was a bedtime song passed from mother to daughter. A quiet walk before dusk. A gentle tapping at the window to scare away the night's heavier thoughts. It's easy to laugh at lettuce water and onion sniffing. But beneath it all, the Victorian obsession with sleep wasn't foolish, it was deeply human. A reminder that when the lights go out and the world falls silent, we're all just trying to find a way back to rest. Even now, as you lie there, perhaps adjusting your pillow for the 5th time or listening to the hum of a fan, you carry forward the same rituals, the same superstitions, the same stubborn hope. That sleep when it comes will be soft. That dreams when they find you will be kind. And that somehow your brain will forgive you for thinking about clockwork lullabies and sleep helmets all night. So here you are, nestled somewhere between wide-eyed curiosity and the comforting weight of historical absurdity. The fire has long since died in the Victorian hearth, and your eyelids may be starting to feel as heavy as a velvet sleep tent. But before we fade entirely into the hush, let's take one last sleepy look at how it all comes together, the medicines, the machines, the myths, and the many, many mugs of warm milk. In the end, the Victorian era didn't find a magic cure for insomnia. No silver bullet, no perfect potion. What they found instead was a kind of bedtime culture, a collective effort to turn sleep into something worth courting. Think of it like this: instead of fighting insomnia with brute force, they flirted with it, wrote it poetry, dressed up for it, set the room just so with fragrant sachets and ticking clocks like lullaby metronomes. They didn't fall asleep. They invited sleep, begged it, bribed it with lavender and leeches. And yes, leeches. In some particularly committed households, a common remedy involved attaching leeches behind the ears to draw out congested blood. The theory that poor circulation to the brain was keeping you awake. The result likely more stress than sleep. But hey, commitment is commitment. Still, even those who skipped the leeches were deeply invested in bedtime. They believed in it like a sacred rite. Some knelt to pray, others chanted German poetry in a whisper. A few even staged mock funerals for their waking thoughts, literally saying goodbye to the day before letting the body drift. Not every cure was gentle. Some involved mustard poultices on the chest or vinegar foot baths hot enough to melt toenails. But no matter how odd, all of it was rooted in one shared desire to surrender safely to unconsciousness. Even the doctors, for all their dubious treatments, seemed to understand that sleep was a fragile thing. They spoke of it like a creature you mustn't frighten, a small white fox slipping through the woods of your mind. Too much noise, too much light, even the wrong thought at the wrong moment, and it vanishes. And so they whispered, dimmed the gas lights, prescribed baths under the moon. They did not always succeed, but they tried. And in their trying, they left us something beautiful. A reminder that sleep isn't just a biological function. It's a ceremony, a ritual, a final kindness you offer yourself at the end of each day. And now, dear listener, after our long journey through damp nightgowns, lettuce tonics, Psalms pills, and portable aroma clocks, it's your turn. Let's let the story slow. Let the curtains close. Let the hum of imagined candlelight flicker in the background. Your room, yes, this one is quiet now. The bed is soft, not grand, but enough. The fan hums like the old drowsifiers once did. Not ticking, not chiming, just the low, even hush of modern air. A sound the Victorians would have found luxurious, alien, probably unhealthy. You shift a little. Your limbs remember stillness. Your thoughts begin to wander, but not with urgency, with gentleness, a kind of brain drifting, the kind that starts, not with questions, but with images. A warm room in a quiet house, a hand on your back not to rouse, but to calm, the scent of chamomile and old paper, the slow, rhythmic pull of a woolen blanket rising with your breath. You do not have to count sheep. You do not have to align your bed to magnetic north. You do not have to take another sip of onion wine or recite the book of Psalms in Latin. You just have to be here. Soft, still, ready. Sleep may be late, or it may be just around the corner. Either way, you've done enough. Your only job now is to let the night hold you. And so, like the old sleep companions once whispered, close your eyes, darling. Everything else can wait. And now we soften. No more foot baths, no more sleep helmets, no more Victorian fretting about humors and air currents. Just stillness, gentle, breathable stillness. You've wandered far tonight through dimly lit parlors and candle-scented bedrooms, past velvet-curtained beds and rooms filled with lavender mist. You've seen what people will do to chase a good night's rest, how hard they'll try, how strangely, even sweetly they hope. And now none of it matters. The lettuce water, the weighted shawl, the chanting. You're not in a drawing room anymore. You're not in a sleep coach's fainting couch or beneath a tin canopy of oils and prayers. You're here, just here. The covers are just a little heavier now. Or maybe your body's just a little softer in the mattress. Your breathing, without thinking, has grown slower. The world beyond the walls has faded to a hum. Nothing is urgent. Everything can wait until morning. The people who made those peculiar cures are long gone. Their cities quieter, their candlelit nights dimmer. But their quest for peace, for rest, for that final gentle letting go is the same as yours. And that dear dreamer makes you part of the story. So breathe in once slowly. Let it out longer. Sink just a little deeper into the bed. And let the past dissolve into silence. There's nothing left to remember. Only the drifting. Only the hush. Only the night.